Visiting Orlando today, there is a lot of different entertainment and theme parks to experience, but the one that stands out from the rest is SeaWorld. Half aquatic zoo and half coaster park, SeaWorld Orlando is run like the Six Flags of the city, with underpaid staff who mostly don't care, long inefficient lines for rides and food, and everything is overpriced, even to the point where Universal and Disney's merchandise and food look downright reasonable in comparison. SeaWorld today, along with its other parks and Busch Gardens, has been ravaged by a private equity firm known as Hill Path Capital, which cuts corners at every opportunity, while opting to focus on only building more coasters to bring people in. I don't have any issues with SeaWorld becoming the coaster park of Orlando, but when it feels like this place is barely able to operate and feels like it's on the verge of closing while the company boasts record profits, you can see that there's a fundamental sickness that trickles down from the top. Like Busch Gardens, SeaWorld may not be as well themed as the other parks in Central Florida, but they have always stood out as themed coaster parks, which in the past were very special in their own way. I love a good coaster weaving throughout a themed area like Busch Gardens Tampa's SheiKra, or the way SeaWorld's Manta incorporates the kinetic movement of its trains into a lush, beautiful landscape. They may lack the high level of theming and dark rides of Disney and Universal, but they offer a different kind of experience that, if run well, has its own place that is distinguished through its emphasis on thrills. SeaWorld Orlando is currently in a rough state that fails to live up to its potential, and yet I do find the park fascinating. Among its one-train operations and hidden surcharges for food and merch, there is a beautiful park with interesting themed lands, wonderful animals and areas to view them, and a world-class lineup of coasters. It makes you wonder though, how did the park become the way it is today? How do excellent themed rides and areas exist alongside others that feel abandoned, and how did the park that was once known for epic marine life shows and Shamu become the Six Flags of Orlando? SeaWorld is certainly not without its controversial history, which harmed it financially and led it down the path it's on today, but it's still a fascinating park that is worth diving into the history of. You might recall that a little over a year ago, I produced an extensive look into the fascinating history of Busch Gardens Tampa, chronicling its development as a European-style beer garden complex, and evolving into an African-themed coaster park that also had a pretty good run until the last decade. It's a park with a history as rich as Knott's Berry Farm, and while I think less has changed at SeaWorld Orlando, I thought it was worth taking a complete look at its history too. From its humble origins as a collection of marine pavilions in the 1970s, to its expansion under Anheuser-Busch, and through the dark years past Blackfish, I wanted to produce a video that dives into the history of one of the world's most remarkable theme parks. Hey, just a quick favor, but videos like these take a ton of time and research to produce, so if you'd like to support the video and the channel, you can really help me out by leaving a like. The story of SeaWorld begins in 1938, where a complex known as Marine Studios opened roughly 20 miles south of St. Augustine, Florida. Initially designed for film production that specialized in underwater scenes, Marine Studios was home to captured bottlenose dolphins, and throughout the 1940s, feeding demonstrations evolved into more complex shows where the dolphins would perform tricks. Marine Studios changed its name to Marineland of Florida in the early 1950s, and through its success, another complex opened off the coast in Palos Verdes, California in 1954. This complex was much larger and was notable through its striking architecture, designed by famous Los Angeles architect William Pereira. Known as Marineland of the Pacific, in addition to its aquariums, the shows allowed guests to sit down and watch bottlenose dolphins and sea lions perform simple tricks, which was a relatively new novelty at the time, especially for the West Coast. In 1961, the facility also briefly became home to the world's first orca held in captivity after she was suspected of being injured out in the ocean. Named Wanda, she sadly died 2 days after being placed in the tank, but in 1967, they introduced Orky, who was then followed by Corky in '68. Both whales unfortunately died within 2 years, but as the facility continued to learn about their care, orcas became a staple of the experience throughout the 1970s, and introduced the idea to the public that it was possible to hold these animals in captivity and incorporate them into shows. The first orca to actually perform in front of audiences with a trainer was found at the Seattle Marine Aquarium though, which in 1965 premiered an orca named Namu, who was named after the Canadian port where he was captured. The ethics of catching orcas and other aquatic mammals aside, they were a huge attraction as they are impressive animals that most people had never seen up close. Namu was even filmed and featured at the facility in the 1966 film Namu the Killer Whale, which attempted to show audiences the more caring and intelligent side of these animals. Moving in a very different direction, another component of the story of SeaWorld involves a man named George Millay, where after graduating from UCLA in 1955, worked briefly as a stockbroker for the next few years. Pursuing a more creative endeavor as a young businessman, in 1958, Millay and a few partners opened a Polynesian restaurant in Long Beach, California, known as The Reef. Following the popularity of tiki-themed restaurants at the time, The Reef reportedly did very well, and since it was located on the water in Long Beach Harbor, Millay proposed an idea for a submarine lounge, where patrons would take an escalator into an underwater pod that served as a bar. Inside, you would be able to look out into the water, and reportedly, Millay was interested in having a show outside of the windows which involved marine animals. To see if this was viable, Millay consulted one of his former UCLA fraternity brothers, Ken Norris, to see if the show would work. Norris was consulted because he was a curator for Marine Land of the Pacific, but after it was concluded that the water quality of the bay was too murky, the submarine bar idea was abandoned. However, Millay reportedly received an anonymous package in the mail that detailed the financials of Marine Land, which was likely sent by Norris, implying that their own version of such a complex would be financially viable. After a bit of prodding, he and Millay began developing a new idea, a tropical-themed marine park that put on similar animal shows. Through its ambitious scope, it was named SeaWorld, and scouting out locations, Millay, Norris, and 2 other investors that they had met in college settled on San Diego. The city was in a period of revival as beach resorts were rising up along its coast, and the city was looking for entertainment to complement the rise in tourism. Millay and his associates convinced the city to let them build SeaWorld, and the park opened in 1964, which, in addition to the marine shows and aquariums, featured the sponsored Hawaiian Punch Village, which was an eatery, and a Japanese village where divers swam down and retrieved pearls. Early SeaWorld in San Diego was a series of small pavilions dressed up among a tropical Pacific theme, but while it was promised to the city that the attraction would receive 1 million visitors in its first year, it underperformed and only saw about 400,000 people. Quickly though, the park did grow its attendance, which was certainly helped by introducing the first orca in 1966. Originally captured a few months after Namu and introduced to the Seattle Marine Aquarium in the same tank, this new female orca was named Shamu, a shortened version of She-Namu. The 2 whales were aggressive and did not get along, and after SeaWorld had been established for a year, Shamu was sold to them in December of 1965, where she was quickly introduced for the following year. Obviously, orcas became the main attraction for SeaWorld parks throughout the next few decades, and while the original Shamu died in 1971, other orcas would take on her name for the shows due to audience familiarity. With the success of SeaWorld in San Diego, Millay was approached by Earl Gascoigne, the marketing director of Cedar Point in 1966, who proposed a second SeaWorld next to the park. While Millay never went through with this proposal, it opened up the idea of building in the Midwest. 2 years later, Gascoigne had left Cedar Point to revive the struggling amusement park Geauga Lake in Aurora, Ohio, and by this time, Millay was more receptive to the idea of a Midwest park, especially since SeaWorld went public in 1968, resulting in the company having a lot more cash. In an effort to revive Geauga Lake, Millay was convinced to open his park right next to it, which did occur in 1970 and was named SeaWorld Cleveland. Along with its lack of proximity to ocean water and seasonal operation due to the snowy winters, the park did have many operational challenges not found in San Diego, but due to the strong and dense middle-class population of the Midwest, SeaWorld Cleveland was very successful, exceeding expectations and seeing 1.1 million guests in its first 100-day season. Riding high on this accomplishment, another SeaWorld park was certainly considered, and with the opening of Walt Disney World and the Magic Kingdom in 1971, just outside of Orlando, it was clear that the next SeaWorld park should be located there. Not only could this new park operate year-round in the Florida climate, but where there is Disney, there is also guaranteed tourism. SeaWorld Orlando opened in 1973, and since it was modeled after the parks in San Diego and Aurora, it was significantly smaller and almost unrecognizable from the massive park you can experience today. On walking in, the entrance was very different, which had the SeaWorld name set onto a large blue trapezoid that you walked under to get to the turnstiles. Underneath the roof of this open-air structure, there were panels which advertised the various exhibits and pavilions, and walking in, the park was a lush green landscape with a ton of lawn space, which was dotted with gift shops and restaurants. Moving clockwise around the park, we first moved past one of these restaurants and a playground before entering the seal feeding pool. Here, you would feed fish to seals and sea lions by just dangling your hand over the wall, which seems dangerous, but it was the 1970s. Moving to the right at the center of the park, a small island contained a sponsored pavilion by Union 76, which was known as World of the Sea Pacific Tide Pool. Here, a shallow outdoor pool let you touch or pet fish and invertebrates. From what I could see on maps, sometime between 1976 and 1980, the tide pool switched out the fauna and was renamed as the Caribbean Tide Pool, but heading inside the pavilion, World of the Sea, guests could wander this indoor aquarium. I don't know if this started as just fish from the Pacific tropics, but by the time the tide pool theme was changed, the aquarium was a mix of exhibits from both the Pacific and the Caribbean. Continuing clockwise around the park, you next encounter the GAF-sponsored Whale and Dolphin Stadium, which in the earliest years of the park was the main attraction. Here in this pool, dolphins would perform tricks alongside an orca, which went by the stage name of Shamu. While I believe that the stadium has had refurbishments and modifications made over the decades, I'm quite sure that this is the same structure being used for the dolphin shows today. The first iteration of this show was titled Shamu Goes Hollywood, which, judging from the eclectic costumes, ties the show into a movie production theme. However, it appears that the staging and theme of the show and stadium changed quite often, where by 1975, the background buildings were replaced with a nautical-looking structure that was labeled as Ocean University. I don't want to cover every iteration of the dolphin and orca show, because I don't think it's documented well enough to even do so, but I do think these early iterations are interesting, and by at least 1980, the show was renamed again to This is Shamu. Continuing clockwise, the next attraction was called Japanese Village, Pearls of the Sea. Like in San Diego, this small area took you through a depiction of a Japanese coastal village where divers would retrieve oysters from a pool. Once on the surface, staff would break the oysters open and retrieve the pearl, selling it as a souvenir to tourists. Continuing forward into the top right corner of the park, the next attraction was the Coca-Cola Seal and Penguin Stadium, which in its earliest years had a circus-themed show titled Dingling Bros Circus. This first version of the show obviously contained seals and penguins, but also sea lions as well. This is definitely the same stadium that is there today though, and as the show changed throughout the years, the staging was swapped out for new themes, and additional aquatic critters made their debut. Continuing around the park and now heading back towards the entrance, an indoor theater hosted a show known as Fountain Fantasy. Once seated inside, a curtain would lift, and fountains synced to music would light up and dance for a 15-minute show. Finishing out the loop of the park, the last section contained two pavilions. First, the dolphin feeding pool allowed you to hand feed dolphins, which, considering their razor-sharp teeth, looks even more dangerous than the seals and the sea lions. Adjacent to this was the sponsored Hawaiian Punch Village, which contained a restaurant, a tiki bar, and a live band that played music as hula girls came out and danced. Considering that a version of the show was once called Drums of Tahiti, I very much doubt that any of this was authentic. Another notable feature, which was also viewable in San Diego, was an animated band that was led by Punchy, the Hawaiian Punch mascot. It's also worth mentioning that there were other miscellaneous animal exhibits dotted around the pathways, but this finishes out the attractions for the first operating year of the park. Returning back to Marineland in California, in 1966, the Oceanarium added the Sky Tower, an observation platform that had 2 decks that rose 244 feet into the air, which provided an excellent view of the ocean. Since SeaWorld San Diego was so derivative of Marineland, it added its own Sky Tower in 1969, which stood significantly taller at 320 feet. While SeaWorld Orlando did not open with one, their own version premiered in the summer of 1974, which is located right next to the lagoon and still stands tallest at 400 feet today. For the first 3 years of the park, you couldn't move out past the lagoon, but in 1976, a path extended out from the Hawaiian Punch Village into the body of water, which was now named as the Atlantis Lagoon. With this came the opening of a complex with stadium seating, which was known as the Atlantis Theater, and looking out over the lagoon, park guests could experience Salute to the Superheroes water ski show. Featuring performers dressed as DC's most iconic superheroes, this show involved a series of stunts on skis, which ran from 1976 through 1979 at both the Orlando and Ohio parks. It's definitely a strange addition, and after the DC theme retired, the ski show would continue to change and cycle through themes every few years. The 1970s was a turbulent time for SeaWorld leadership though, as in 1974, George Millay left the company. There are conflicting reports over whether he was pushed out or simply just disagreed with the direction that the company was heading, but after he resigned, he went on to develop Wet n Wild, which opened in 1977 as the world's first water park and was right up the street from SeaWorld Orlando, which is appropriately vindictive. However, in 1976, MCA, which was the parent company of Universal at the time, attempted a hostile takeover by purchasing an 8% stake in SeaWorld, offering $22 for the remaining shares for a total bid of $35 million. In a panic, SeaWorld began shopping around for other companies to step in and quickly settled on Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, as in the textbook publisher, for a sum of $65 million. This seemed like a strange fit, but SeaWorld management hoped that their new parent company would be hands-off and would let them operate as they saw fit. This wasn't the case, but HBJ's ownership did lead SeaWorld into a new era of growth through some rather substantial investments. Under their leadership, the next significant addition to SeaWorld Orlando was the Shark Encounter, which opened in 1979 just south of the Seal and Penguin Stadium. This indoor attraction was a sizable aquarium, where the main tank held over 500,000 gallons of salt water and was home to various species of shark. Guests would board a moving walkway which took them through an acrylic tunnel, allowing them impressive close-up views of these intimidating creatures in the dark water. In a brochure from 1980, the park states that this is a 40-minute experience, which also contained a small indoor playground and an educational film on the sharks. From the start, SeaWorld had a colorful cast of meetable costumed characters, such as Pete Penguin or Cap'n Kidd. In 1981, the park opened Cap'n Kidd's World, which was located near the Dolphin and Whale Theater and was based on the character of the same name. This 2-acre plot of land included a climbable pirate ship with water cannons, a ball pit, and a shallow tank where you could pet and feed rays. Following this, the Nautilus Theater was erected just south of the Shark Encounter in 1983. Debuting as an open-air pavilion, it initially premiered with 2 alternating acts, which were titled The Canadian Lumberjacks and Up With People. Later, by 1990, the theater was enclosed and has continued hosting shows up through today. In 1982, Fountain Fantasy closed and the theater went under refurbishment. Opening again in 1983, it was now labeled as the Fantasy Theater, which hosted a pretty ambitious children's musical titled Undersea Fantasy. It looked expensive for a theme park stage show and featured Shamu's friends as they would sing and dance, but it appeared short-lived as the venue was renamed to the SeaWorld Theater either in 1988 or 89. When this occurred, the Fountain Show returned with the slightly different name of Water Fantasy, which ran up through the early 90s until it was permanently replaced with a film about conservation titled Window to the Sea. The most significant change to the park under HBJ was the 1984 introduction of the 6,000-seat Shamu Stadium on the other side of the lake, which completed a loop of the park but also became the most popular attraction. Now, in a 5 million gallon pool with a depth of 35 feet, the orcas were moved out of the stadium they shared with the dolphins allowing them to put on much more impressive and intense performances. The first show to exist in this theater was titled Shamu Celebration, and was unlike anything that audiences had seen before, with the orcas launching trainers 15 feet into the air, and with multiple whales performing synchronized tricks at a time, which couldn't be done at the Dolphin Stadium. Whatever you think of keeping orcas in captivity, which is something that I personally disagree with, it's hard to argue that the orca shows weren't magnificent and extremely captivating. On the other side of the park, the old Dolphin and Whale Stadium was then quickly refurbished and opened again in 1985 with a show titled New Friends, which wouldn't be too remarkable if it wasn't for the dolphins being joined by a beluga whale, which I don't believe has happened since. By this point, the Japanese village had been repurposed into an exhibit for alligators and birds, and the World of the Sea Aquarium had a small manatee pool located behind it, which taught about manatee rescuing and the danger they face from boating. In 1987, the short-lived alligator and bird exhibits were replaced with Penguin Encounter, a pretty sizable pavilion that brought you up alongside a variety of Antarctic penguin species. Walking into the building, park guests stepped onto a moving walkway, which took them on a 2-minute ride past a massive penguin enclosure, which was themed and quite impressive for its time. Stepping off, there were information panels that identified the various penguin species, but also provided facts about them. Moving further into the building, another section was dedicated to alcids, a family of Arctic birds that includes puffins and mures. Walking around the corner, you encounter these species in another themed exhibit, although this one didn't have a moving walkway, so you could spend time here at your own leisure. While SeaWorld's time under HBJ was generally positive and established attractions that are fundamental to the park experience today, Penguin Encounter was the last addition that would be made, because in 1987, the company was suddenly the target of a hostile takeover bid. In response, HBJ restructured, which racked up $2.9 billion worth of debt, and needing to sell off assets to focus on the publishing and insurance side of the business, the theme park division needed to go. This was actually quite poor timing, as wanting to focus on this division, they actually just purchased Marineland of the Pacific in 1986. 6 weeks after the sale, they closed the park, abruptly claiming that the aging complex would cost more to repair than it was worth, but it's clear that they were trying to close down their competitor, and they moved the two orcas, named Orky and Corky, to San Diego. Soon after, HBJ opened SeaWorld San Antonio in 1988, which had been in development prior to the restructuring, and their portfolio also included Cypress Gardens, which was acquired in 1985. They also bought Circus World, a small park outside of Orlando in Haines City that opened in 1974. When HBJ acquired it in 1986, they closed it down and rebuilt it into another amusement park, which opened the following year as Boardwalk and Baseball. Fearing that Cypress Gardens and Boardwalk and Baseball could not be sold off without the SeaWorld parks, HBJ wanted to offload these as a package deal, which put off quite a few buyers. Among those interested were returning businesses such as MCA and even George Millay, who partnered with a group of former park managers. However, the highest bid came from Anheuser-Busch for $1.3 billion, and in 1989, they became the new owners, which sent the parks into a grand new golden period, and this is where things begin to get a lot more interesting. If you watched my video that chronicles the history of Busch Gardens Tampa, then you'll know that I was a very big fan of how the company ran its parks, which put a lot of pride and care into maintaining them. Despite being located 60 miles west of Walt Disney World, Busch Gardens Tampa became reasonably competitive throughout the late 80s as it expanded on its rides and animal exhibits, knowing that its large coasters, Python and Scorpion, made it a unique draw in Florida while still being an excellent family park. However, moving into the 90s, they not only added 2 incredible coaster additions with Kumba and Montu, but the park started embracing theming on a level not unlike what Disney was capable of. Acquiring SeaWorld from HBJ and moving into the heart of Orlando was the next big step for them, especially as Universal Studios Florida would open shortly in 1990, only drawing more people to the city. While all the SeaWorld parks were valuable, the Orlando location was the biggest prize, so after the sale, Anheuser-Busch closed Boardwalk and Baseball almost immediately in 1990 to sell off its assets. As for Cypress Gardens, it stayed operating until 1995, when Busch sold it back to its park management to be run independently. For SeaWorld Orlando, not much actually changed at first, but in 1991, the shark encounter was refurbished and renamed as Terrors of the Deep, which is when I believe a shallow shark pool was added out in front. The summer also saw the park branded by Anheuser-Busch, opening the Clydesdale Hamlet, where you could meet the iconic Clydesdale horses in their stables when they weren't pulling a beer cart throughout the pathways. Adjacent to the stable was the Anheuser-Busch Hospitality Center, which was part restaurant and part microbrewery, which obviously sold Anheuser-Busch products. However, 1992 was the first big step where the park began to transform, where on Memorial Day, the park opened 2 new expansions. Behind Shamu Stadium was Shamu's Happy Harbor, which was dressed in a Caribbean theme and had a giant sand sculpture, a ball pit, a massive multi-story playground with all kinds of climbable elements, and a sailing ship with water cannons and ropes to climb on, although this time it sat in a shallow pool that kids could play in. Weirdly, this just appeared to be an expanded Capping Kids World that was moved across the park, which itself seemed to remain open through the first half of the year. When it closed, the area where you fed the rays stayed open, it was renamed to the Stingray Lagoon. The other major addition that year was a simulator, which was the park's first real ride since the Sky Tower opened 18 years prior. With the opening of Star Tours in Disneyland in 1987, the theme park industry went wild, as this felt like the future of theme park attractions at the time. Epcot opened Body Wars with the Wonders of Life Pavilion in 1989, which was followed 2 months later by Star Tours at Disney MGM Studios, and a year after Universal Studios Florida opened, it debuted Back to the Future the Ride in 1991. When I say that Anheuser-Busch was serious about competing for tourist dollars, you can see it through how they opened their own expensive simulator at Busch Gardens Williamsburg in 1990. Called Questor, this fantasy-themed attraction took you on an adventure to retrieve a powerful crystal, and a version of this ride came to Busch Gardens Tampa the following year. It made sense that SeaWorld would get a simulator too, and adjacent to Shamu's Happy Harbor, this new attraction was known as Mission Bermuda Triangle. The ride is set in this notorious region of the Atlantic, where ships and planes have mysteriously disappeared, and the ride film was produced by Midland Production Company and was a mix of models and practical sets spliced in with actual shots filmed in water. Moving through the open-air queue, information panels display different types of research submersibles and information about animals found in this region. There were also diving vehicles and equipment scattered throughout the switchbacks, but entering into the building, guests would first experience a pre-show which explained the history of mysterious disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle, including the USS Cyclops, which was lost in 1918. Embarking on an expedition to study the region and its marine life, you boarded one of 3 boxy simulator vehicles, and once the ride initiated, the window drops down to reveal the screen, where you start the mission by hanging over the water. Your sub is then submerged, and immediately, you encounter a pod of dolphins. Traveling through the shallows, the captain announces that he's just received a transmission from your sister sub, the Barracuda, which has found something interesting deep in the trench. Following their last known coordinates, your sub makes a turn to meet them, and you travel through a rocky crevice, resulting in a startling encounter with a shark in the darkness. Moving off the shelf and emerging into open water, you move alongside humpback whales, which turns perilous as one accidentally swats your vehicle with its fluke. Diving down into a deep trench, your sub searches in the darkness for the Barracuda, but manages to find the wreck of the USS Cyclops, which must be the discovery that they reported. Encountering the Barracuda, their captain states that they lost radio contact, and that they need to return to the base for repairs due to mysterious systems problems, but in the meantime, you'll keep exploring. Traveling a bit further, a sudden earthquake rocks the ocean floor, and you collide with a falling piece of the ship. At this point, an air blast effect releases into the cabin to simulate the sub losing pressure, and with systems failing, your sub loses power as the ship begins to teeter and falls into the trench. As it does so, it pulls you down along with it, as a ghostly light at the bottom of the trench creates a silhouette, and as you sink, a mysterious force seems to teleport you back to the shallows, where, ascending to the surface, you're met with a rescue chopper, as the captain wonders what mysterious encounter everyone had just witnessed. Mission Bermuda Triangle is a relatively unknown piece of SeaWorld history, but I think that because it was so short-lived, only existing for 3 years, that the idea of the ride was more interesting than the actual experience. Still, it was a good first step for SeaWorld in regard to diversifying its attractions, and moving into 1993, a new building opened behind the Dolphin Stadium, which was titled Manatees: The Last Generation. On the outside of the exhibit, you could view manatees in the water while looking down from above, and entering into the building, park visitors walked down a long ramp into a domed theater. From here, a film was projected onto the dome that highlighted the dangers that manatees face from man-made threats, and emerging out at a lower elevation, you were able to view the manatees from underwater, which was pretty neat. SeaWorld has been rescuing and rehabilitating animals since 1965, and with Anheuser-Busch, which had its own rescue programs, those efforts were further emphasized with this new, sizable exhibit. Continuing into 1994, a temporary attraction known as Monster Marsh opened in March and ran through the year, which allowed visitors to walk an educational trail full of mechanized dinosaurs. The current video on screen shows this attraction when it was duplicated and opened at the Ohio Park the same year, but you get the general idea of what this was intended to be. 1994 also saw the opening of Pacific Point Preserve, which was a massive exhibit featuring seals and sea lions that was themed as a rocky Pacific coastline. Appropriately located behind the Sea Lion and Otter Stadium, SeaWorld ambassadors would come out and share stories and facts about the animals, while visitors are able to purchase fish to throw at them, which means the loudest and most aggressive are usually rewarded the most. This is a pretty sizable exhibit that's been a highlight of the park ever since it premiered. And it was clear by this point that Anheuser-Busch was dedicated to transforming and adding to the park with new attractions every single year. For 1995, Mission Bermuda Triangle operated up through April, were then closed for a month and reopened as the slightly rethemed Wild Arctic, featuring a new film. At the time, park management reported that the attraction was still popular, but since a new building was established and connected to the ride with a massive new animal exhibit, it made sense to change the film to fit the new theme. Walking into Wild Arctic, the queue layout was pretty much the same, but you were greeted with a new pre-show. In the first room, the video explains the history of exploration in the Arctic, highlighting the 1845 expedition of John Franklin, where his 2 ships and crew were lost while trying to chart the Northwest Passage through Canada. Embarking on your own research expedition from the Franklin Exploration Center to study Arctic animals, riders are led into the next room, where, watching mounted televisions hanging overhead, you meet First Officer Norm Miller, who states that your helicopter, White Thunder, will be piloted by Captain Emerson. The helicopter will take you to a research facility known as Base Station Wild Arctic, and Miller goes through a safety spiel that covers the loading process for the vehicle. Once inside the simulator, it begins with your helicopter ascending out of a hangar and out into the snow, where you hover over a man who waves while being pulled on a dog sled. While traveling, you move through mountains, fly over a herd of caribou, and make a short side trip where you hover over a pair of polar bear cubs who are protected by their mother. Flying over a glacier and into a bay, your apparent super vehicle dives underwater, where you encounter a pod of narwhals, before then quickly surfacing and encountering walruses on the ice. As you ascend, a storm warning causes the pilot to land on a glacier to ride it out, but after a moment, the ice begins to collapse. Falling down the cliff, the pilot engages the thrusters that are apparently a feature of your super helicopter, and you just hit the water before zooming back up and turning back to watch the glacier crumble. With the storm still approaching, the pilot decides to take what he calls the emergency route, which involved diving into a dangerous canyon, and as the wind picks up, an avalanche occurs. Flying out, away from the falling debris, the pilot announces that we've made it, and spotting the base, which is built around a shipwreck, the hangar doors open and you make your landing. While Mission Bermuda Triangle was quite silly, the premise of Wild Arctic was just downright absurd, and while this was the only version of the simulator that I experienced, I can say that as someone who never really gets sick on rides, even this left me feeling nauseated just through how rough it was. I think it's great that Anheuser-Busch was trying something different to stand out among Universal and Disney, but their simulators were never very strong. However, the real attraction in my mind was the attached animal exhibit, where walking out from the base, you encounter the shipwreck, which sits over a pool of water that contains beluga whales. Notable here is an ice wall, which is an interactive feature that's fun for kids, but the area is also a very strong thematic reveal, which immerses you into the Arctic setting. Exiting this first room, you first travel down into the ship, then through an expedition tent full of equipment and supplies, and finally down a ramp into the base itself, which is partially built into the rock. In addition to the atmospheric theming, the Wild Arctic exhibit used to feature polar bears, which was pretty rare for a zoological exhibit, but it has always contained walruses too, which are also exciting to see. Throughout Wild Arctic, small, interactive, and educational challenges were worked into the theming, and exiting through the cave tunnel, you return to the gift shop which led back out into the park. The nauseating helicopter ride aside, which could also be experienced in a stationary theater or skipped entirely, the animal portion of Wild Arctic is remarkably well themed and one of the coolest experiences in Orlando, so it was a huge step up for Anheuser-Busch when it was introduced. Going into 1996, the park continued expanding on this by retheming the old Stingray Lagoon into a small land called Key West. Obviously inspired by Key West, Florida, the structure of these old buildings didn't change too much, but they were refreshed with a new theme and merchandise. Along with the new relaxing Calypso soundtrack, the Stingray pool was slightly expanded with a mini cove which contains juvenile rays. The year also saw the introduction of Turtle Point, which taught visitors about the dangers that sea turtles face, and replaced the old Manatee pool since that now had its own exhibit. Between Key West and the Dolphin Theater, Dolphin Cove was also added, which is a themed 700,000-gallon lagoon that is home to bottlenose dolphins. The original dolphin feeding pool, which had been known as the Dolphin Community Pool since at least Busch had taken ownership, was now changed into the Dolphin Nursery, which hosted juvenile dolphins with their mothers since the park now had a new, proper display tank. In addition to Dolphin Cove hosting informational shows with ambassadors and trainers, the new exhibit also included underwater viewing as well, which has obviously been quite popular. Moving to the front of the park, the old entrance structure and buildings were iconic but dated, so starting in 1997 and finishing in the spring of 1998, the entire entrance area was completely redone in phases to become a seaside village. Alongside the new guest services building was a harbor with a SeaWorld lighthouse, where surrounded by statues of seals and walruses perched on rocks, a wave machine in the water would cause it to crash up alongside the structure and along the boardwalk where guests would be. In addition to the rotating lighthouse lamp, the waves created a unique kinetic feature for the park entrance, and stepping inside past the new security and turnstiles, old buildings were refurbished and rethemed. The entrance area didn't have a name, as it was just called the entrance, and the new building style was vaguely Caribbean or Key West, which tied it well into the nearby Key West area, but I don't think that it was intended to be anything specific. In conjunction with the cold water animals around the lighthouse, I think the new entrance was just supposed to convey an ambiguous seaside theme, which manages to work really well as an improvement of the very dated buildings of the 1970s, which showed Busch's commitment to theming even further. Busch's ownership and the 90s were a great time for SeaWorld with the addition of the simulator, the themed animal exhibits, and even some new, smaller lands, but in 1998, the park would add an attraction that was unlike anything else ever seen before. Up until this point, the thing that distinguished SeaWorld from the other Orlando parks was its variety of animal exhibits, and of course their shows. The orcas were still the most attractive reason to visit SeaWorld, and the simulator was a great addition for its time, but among the big dark rides of Disney and Universal, Anheuser-Busch developed a distinguishing attraction that rose to their level. Part dark ride and part thrill ride, SeaWorld worked with Mach to develop a themed attraction using their new water coaster design, which combined a traditional roller coaster with log flume elements to create something quite unique. Opening in April of 1998, the spectacular Journey to Atlantis was an excellent new thrill attraction that was hidden inside a striking facade of the city, which used forced perspective really well to create a structure that feels absolutely massive. hearing the screams of people as they dropped out in front, it developed intrigue by making you wonder what was going on inside. Entering into the queue, which is actually relatively short, you walk through a Greek fishing village that was unexpectedly disturbed by the city having just risen out of the sea. Boarding the vehicle, which was designed to look like a fishing boat, it moves into the first scene, which is dressed as the village. Stopping for a brief moment, a door opens and a resident insists that you take Hermes as your guide as he holds up a seahorse statue. Following a traveling LED light effect, your boat moves into a tunnel that lights up with stars, proceeding then underwater into a colorful reef. You're beckoned forward by a projection of a mermaid who warns you not to be afraid, and after passing by a hammerhead shark on the left, a model of the city lights up on your right, making it appear as if you're approaching it from far away. Transitioning into the next scene, a statue with a woman's face is laughing, but the laughter quickly becomes demented as the face washes away through a projection effect. Traveling through the city now, the light of Hermes illuminates the scene as his seahorse avatar emerges out of a fountain, and as the boat moves through, jumping fountains shoot over the heads of riders. After entering the temple and passing a fluttering Hermes on the left, a projection of the ride's villain, the siren Allura, appears on a fountain to the right. She chastises you for daring to enter her domain as she transforms into a menacing figure with snakes for hair, and floating along further, you encounter a figure of Hermes who pops out of a vase as he mutters in terror. Seeing green eyes out of the darkness, a lightning flash reveals the monstrous form of Allura as she moves towards the boat, and climbing up the lift hill to the drop, her eyes watch as you ascend. Moving through the doors at the top, it turns out that this is a fake out, and rounding the bend outside, you climb another lift hill even higher. As you do so and reaching the top, the Beetlejuice theme played for whatever reason, and entering a small room at the peak of the temple, you drop down to escape Allura as she laughs maniacally. Crashing into the water below and getting soaked, you've escaped from Atlantis. Although, as you round the bend, people watching the ride from the pathway are able to pay and press a button to squirt riders with water. Falling down a short drop, which usually gets you wetter than the big splash, you then quickly ascended another lift hill, which sent you through an archway with waterfalls spilling out of the side, lightly splashing the riders. Moving back into the city, you quickly realize you actually haven't escaped, and moving through what appears to be a graveyard with broken sails and treasure, lit among dozens of candles, you hear Allura laugh as you dip down into the dark. Diving down a steep coaster track, you emerge out into a splashdown, where finally having escaped, you return back to the station. As you exited the ride through the themed shop, the Golden Seahorse, you could also move off to the side and enter the small but often overlooked Jewel of the Sea Aquarium. Designed as an Atlantis-themed rotunda with tanks in both the floor and ceiling, the space is also home to tanks set into the walls, which host a variety of sea life. This is one of my favorite spots in the park because it's atmospheric and hidden away from the crowds, but I like how Busch also used this ride to add an additional themed exhibit into the park, even if it is relatively small. Was Journey to Atlantis perfect? Well, no, because its story and lore aren't really clear, and transitions between scenes are often awkward, but the ride was still remarkably impressive and well themed for 1998, really showing how serious Busch was about competing in the Orlando market. Throughout the 90s, Anheuser-Busch saw a lot of success by introducing large P&M coasters, with Busch Gardens Tampa receiving Kumba and Montu, and Williamsburg opening Alpengeist and Apollo's Chariot. Williamsburg did also open the Aero coaster Drachenfire in 1992, which was a rare disaster for them, and SeaWorld San Antonio did open the D.H. Morgan coaster known as Steel Eel in 1999. It's clear that Anheuser-Busch, while proud of their animal exhibits, wanted to continue evolving the parks with larger, more intense coasters. Moving into the new millennium, and after a complicated corporate history, Geauga Lake was rebranded as Six Flags Ohio, which put into question the future of SeaWorld Cleveland, which by this point was known as SeaWorld Ohio. While it did open its own version of Mission Bermuda Triangle in 2000, the park was otherwise not allowed to build more traditional rides and coasters due to a non-compete clause that went back to 1970. Seeing no future here, Anheuser-Busch sold the park off in 2001, where it was incorporated into Six Flags Ohio. Following the success of the Busch Gardens parks though, SeaWorld Orlando introduced their own B&M looper in 2000, which was known as the Kraken. Opening adjacent to Journey to Atlantis, the coaster is generally considered less interesting than Kumba, or even Islands of Adventure's The Incredible Hulk, which just opened the year before, but it was still a great addition at a time when Orlando did not have too many larger coasters. In my opinion, the layout is actually quite underrated, and what allowed it to stand out was its floorless trains, which were a big deal at the time. The coaster also had a Kraken statue viewable from the pathway, which defied expectations as it was designed to be an eel rather than a giant squid, but the mythical theme was a perfect complement to the nearby city of Atlantis. Diving under the Kraken statue and into a trench, the train then emerges out into a corkscrew, which is a fantastic kinetic element that can be seen from the pathway. Stepping into a nearby rocky cave, this was originally a small animal exhibit, which continued the trend of Busch opening aquariums alongside big rides. Labeled thematically as Kraken eggs, the cave contained glass spheres with water running down the sides that acted as small tanks for eels. It appeared that year by year, Busch was enhancing different sections of the park, and by placing the Kraken right next to Journey to Atlantis in what appears to be a Phase 2, this small, new, mythical themed area was a great addition for the park. In 2001, the show in the SeaWorld Theater, which was known as Pets on Stage, became Pets Ahoy. I believe Pets on Stage replaced the Window to the Sea film by at least 1995, which used to rescue cats and dogs for a cute show, although no footage of this seems to have ever been posted online. However, Pets Ahoy was the more well-known version. It was the first step in a revival of this area of the park. Continuing the trend of reinvigorating old areas with theming, 2003 introduced the waterfront, which replaced old buildings and the Hawaiian Village with a new waterfront district designed in a Mediterranean style. The purpose of the waterfront was to act as an area with more upscale shopping and dining to attract local pass holders, and this pivot towards a more adult market was SeaWorld's version of a downtown Disney, or the Epcot Resort area with its shops, clubs, and restaurants. The SeaWorld Theater with Pets Ahoy was renamed to the Seaport Theater, and next to the Sky Tower there is a small row of bleachers which overlook a tank. Bringing pearl diving back into the park, divers perform here with the adjacent shop selling jewelry and pearls. I wasn't old enough to judge how successful the waterfront was for the park before it devolved into the cheap quick service and the tacky shops of today, but I have always enjoyed its theming and atmosphere, and I do like the idea of a more upscale shopping and dining district. Moving into the later years of Busch's ownership though, investment began to slow down. In 2005, Shamu's Happy Harbor added a spinning bucket ride known as Swishy Fishies, along with a spinning jellyfish tower, Jazzy Jellies. The year also saw a small kids coaster, Shamu Express, introduced alongside these as well. These additions weren't much, but in further balancing out the offerings of the park, it reinforced that SeaWorld was a great experience for families. In 2007, Shamu's Happy Harbor was also joined by the Sea Carousel with fun aquatic creatures to ride, as well as a variation of a rock and tug called Ocean Commotion. The last major addition made by Anheuser-Busch required demolishing the Tropical Reef, but in its place, a brand new attraction premiered in 2009. Known as Manta, this B&M flying coaster creates a wonderful kinetic spectacle just past the entrance area as the Manta-themed trains fly by and use fountain effects to make it appear as if they're splashing through the water. Located in a massive building disguised with a rocky facade and Caribbean-style buildings, the queue leads you into a massive aquarium where, as you walk through, different windows give you glimpses into a large tank full of fish and rays. As you move along, each window gets wider and shows the tank from a different angle, until eventually you reach a large reveal. Heading further into the queue, you come up on a smaller tank with fish right before you take the stairs up to the station. Manta as a flying coaster has a pretty solid layout, but it's elevated through its thematic and kinetic effects, a special, graceful soundtrack as you ascend the lift hill, and the aquarium, which reportedly cost more than the actual coaster itself. You don't have to go into the queue to see the aquarium though, as off to the side, it has its own entrance. Working as a spiritual successor to the tropical reef that opened with the park, You're able to see into the massive tank that's present from the queue, but there are also many other tanks with other remarkable creatures found throughout this extensive attraction. Anheuser-Busch really outdid themselves with Manta and the aquarium, continuing to show Disney and Universal tourists what made them unique and worth visiting. Ironically, by the time the attraction opened, Busch was no longer the owner of the park though, as due to infighting from the Busch family, the company was the victim of a hostile takeover from a Belgian-Brazilian brewer called InBev. After fighting the takeover throughout the summer of 2008, the company agreed to a buyout, and that was the end of Anheuser-Busch, as it was incorporated into a new company known as Anheuser-Busch InBev. With the Busch family gone, what did that mean for the future of SeaWorld, especially since so much thematic investment had been put into it over the past 20 years? Since InBev had no interest in the park business, it quickly looked to sell them off, and in October of 2009, they were purchased for $2.3 billion by a private equity firm known as the Blackstone Group. Retaining current park management, the new parks company was named SeaWorld Parks and Entertainment, and was essentially asked to keep running the parks as they had been, but now diversifying the business with a television and animation division to spread the SeaWorld brand. The Busch name was licensed in perpetuity for the Busch Gardens parks, but the Clydesdale horses were removed, which included SeaWorld as well. By early 2010, the horse stable at SeaWorld Orlando was closed, and the Anheuser-Busch Hospitality Center removed its branding and was renamed as The Terrace, which at the time was still a buffet and a walk-up bar. I don't want to get gruesome in this video, but in order to understand the direction that SeaWorld would take next, I do need to briefly cover non-descriptive reports of orca attacks. In February of 2010, a major event shone a spotlight on the company, as during the Dine with Shamu show, which allowed guests to eat alongside the orcas, seasoned trainer Don Brancheau was pulled into the water and violently dragged around before drowning. The orca responsible was named Tilikum, who was a prize for SeaWorld, as measuring in at 22 feet long, he was the largest orca ever held in captivity and was a legendary draw due to his sheer size. However, Tilikum was originally sold off to SeaWorld in 1992, where after residing at Sealand of the Pacific in Victoria, he drowned a trainer there in the pool after she slipped in, resulting in the park wanting to get rid of him. In 1999, a man who had hidden inside SeaWorld until after the park closed went near Tilikum's tank, and was discovered there in the morning, with his body showing evidence of an attack. Tilikum was not the only orca in captivity to lash out and attack trainers though, as since the 1970s, there have been at least 39 reports of this occurring, which even included an incident in 1971 with the original Shamu. This was a well-known issue within the industry, but the incident in 2010 was so shocking that SeaWorld immediately modified its shows to take its trainers out of the water. SeaWorld was then fined $75,000 by OSHA for the incident, but in an act of negligence while trying to fight public scrutiny and government resistance, by 2011, SeaWorld began easing back into trying to get trainers back into the water to eventually develop future shows with the orcas. Moving away from this topic for now though, and returning to chronicling the park's development, 2011 saw a short closure of Manatees The Last Generation, which reopened in 2012 as Turtle Trek, incorporating sea turtles alongside the manatees. However, the direction of travel in the facility was now different, where first, people encountered the manatees in their exhibits, and then moved on to the turtles, which were accompanied by a presentation from one of the animal ambassadors. At this conclusion, you then entered the domed theater last, where a new film puts you into the perspective of a sea turtle hatching from its egg. Moving along the sand, the film shows the dangers that baby sea turtles face from both predators and man-made pollution, and the rest of the film shows the turtle exploring the ocean as it grows up. That same year, the penguin encounter closed in January, with the exhibit and surrounding buildings being demolished for a new attraction that would open the following year. 2012 also saw the company go public in December, as it was renamed to SeaWorld Entertainment, but that year was otherwise uneventful for park investment. However, PETA filed a lawsuit against SeaWorld for enslaving orcas earlier in February, which was immediately dismissed the following day. However ridiculous the stunt, it continued to draw public scrutiny to the issues of holding orcas in captivity, and in 2013, the infamous CNN documentary Blackfish was released, chronicling Tilikum's life and history of incidents, while also highlighting how keeping orcas in captivity was extremely abusive and unhealthy. While many claims have been made that the documentary took a lot of information out of context to create a misleading narrative, the core issue of keeping orcas in relatively tiny tanks and the mental anguish that this causes them led to extremely negative public sentiment towards SeaWorld. Their case certainly wasn't helped when OSHA fined them again in the summer for continuing to not take adequate measures to keep trainers away from the whales, and with public perception becoming overwhelmingly negative, attendance across the SeaWorld parks dropped dramatically through 2017. The orca shows, which were named One Ocean through that period, were modified to have their trainers monologue about how SeaWorld took care of its orcas and how the tricks performed in the show were a form of enrichment. While I don't think that they're being misleading, SeaWorld's main draw to the park had still taken a massive hit, and in 2016, the chain announced that they would cease the orca breeding program and slowly phase out the shows. Despite the controversial nature of SeaWorld and their orcas, I couldn't discuss the course that SeaWorld took without it, but returning back now to a more positive element of 2013, a brand new themed area opened in May. Replacing the penguin encounter with what was essentially a major reworking of the idea, Antarctica opened as a highly themed area, which contained a quick service restaurant named Expedition Cafe and an Antarctic themed gift shop. However, the attraction built for this area was Antarctica Empire of the Penguin, where entering inside the building, riders were funneled into a pre-show room where they watched a video that introduces a colony of Gentoo penguins. Here, you meet a newly hatched chick named Puck, who had to brave the harsh conditions of the Antarctic. Once let out, riders wait through another part of the queue in frozen caves, where they have the option of choosing either the mild or wild part of the experience, which determines whether their vehicle will have enhanced motion during the ride. After being grouped into another pre-show room, where a video that further elaborates on Puck's journey is watched by riders, everyone boards the trackless vehicle. For 2013, this was quite ambitious for SeaWorld, as this was the first modern trackless system introduced in the United States, and as the vehicles pulled out of the station, you moved through an icy cave. Pulling up to screens in the facades, the ride conveyed the idea that you were baby Puck looking at your own reflection in the ice, and as Puck moved on the screen, the vehicles would shift and slide to coordinate with his movement. Moving into the next scene, the caves open up into a cavern, and the vehicles danced around a stunning icicle, as a rainbow of colors was reflected through pockets of ice in the walls. Moving on, Puck is now growing up and moving into the world outside, which brings the vehicles up along a screen with penguins standing in a harsh blizzard. The riders in the wild designated vehicles would spin as if being caught in the wind, and moving into the next room, Puck and another penguin dive into the water, where you have a dangerous encounter with a seal who is hunting you. Escaping out of the water back onto the ice, the vehicles turn around as a shutter door opens, and an inspirational song plays, revealing a window where you view live penguins who are hilariously indifferent to your ride experience. Pulling into the unload station in the next room, riders were shocked by the temperature change and the immediate smell of rotting fish. Once off the ride, park visitors were brought up alongside the new penguin exhibit, which is open air and is home to numerous species of penguin. It's an excellent themed exhibit that's a big improvement over the fondly remembered penguin encounter, and stepping into the final chamber, this room was immediately warmer, offering different views of the penguins from behind a series of glass panels. While I have mixed feelings on this addition to the park, I can say that it's still very well themed, no doubt because old management was retained after the sale of the parks to Blackstone. However, while the exhibit was cool, it was logistically difficult to experience. You couldn't just walk in unless you went up the exit, but just to see the exhibit itself without the ride, you had to wait through a long line and watch the ride's pre-show before entering. The ride itself, while a fun novelty for 2013 with its trackless vehicles, was really just a whole lot of nothing, and judging from how slowly it loaded and the ridiculous lines it created, it had very low rider capacity. On one hand, it was a great family ride, especially for smaller children, but its short ride experience wasn't very interesting beyond its pure novelty of trackless vehicles and seeing the penguins from the ride. Overall, I wouldn't say that it's a bad addition to the park, especially since the new penguin enclosure was a big improvement over the penguin encounter, but it could also be very tedious if you just wanted to experience the exhibit. In the summer of 2014, the park did not receive any new additions, but it did go through a light rebrand while renaming all of its lands. The entrance became Port of Entry, and Sea of Shallows incorporated Manta, Turtle Trek, Dolphin Cove, and Key West. Journey to Atlantis and the Kraken became Sea of Legends, and the nearby Antarctica was Sea of Ice. The waterfront was appropriately named Sea of Delight, and the small area with the Shark Encounter and Nautilus Theater were incorporated into the Sea of Mystery. Finally, adjacent to Shamu's Happy Harbor, the Orca Stadium and Wild Arctic were labeled as Sea of Power. It's not a huge change, and the names were dropped after 2020, but I did think it was an interesting attempt at distinguishing the different areas. In April of 2015, SeaWorld attempted to find a different direction after reeling from Blackfish and brought in Joel Manby as the new CEO. Manby was experienced in the industry as he worked as the CEO for Herschend Family Entertainment, famous for Dollywood and Silver Dollar City, from 2003 and up through 2013. Throughout the SeaWorld and Busch Gardens parks, he pushed for more family-friendly experiences and family coasters, but SeaWorld Orlando still had a big thrill that had yet to debut. Opening in June of 2016, Mako was a B&M hypercoaster that opened adjacent to the Shark Encounter, and for its time, it was absolutely the best roller coaster in Orlando. Continuing the shark motif, its entrance is decorated as a reef with a shipwreck, with the coaster wrapping around the area as a fantastic kinetic draw. Entering into the queue, the landscaping of the first set of switchbacks evoked the feeling of traveling through aquatic vegetation, and stepping under the cover of the station, its light theming evoked the shipwreck with sharks swimming up above. I'm not usually a fan of negative G's on roller coasters because I just don't find them very interesting, but Mako is the exception and is wildly fun. While Manta introduced a soundtrack as it has its own graceful piece that plays from external speakers on its lift hill, Mako took this a step further, with 3 different exciting and aggressive tracks that alternate with each train as they ascend the lift hill. This is a great thematic way to build anticipation as riders slowly climb the 200-foot incline, and worth noting is the original score for the area too, where as the coaster loops around the entrance, the mysterious tone gives way to something sweeping and exciting. Mako is by far the best coaster in the park, and was an incredible addition that still holds up, especially since it ties thematically into the still popular Shark Encounter. Manby's time as CEO was mixed, because there were some high-profile failures at the other parks, like the underwhelming Ocean Explorer area in 2017 for SeaWorld San Diego. I also want to mention my disappointment with the 2017 refurb of Journey to Atlantis, where the fountains and moving effects were turned off, greatly reducing the ride experience. Another bad decision made that year was the introduction of Kraken Unleashed, which tried to refresh the coaster experience by adding VR headsets. The area was refreshed with a new original soundtrack, but the eelhead and theming was replaced, with the arms of a giant squid twisting throughout the area and the entrance side instead. While VR headsets on the coaster trains were an interesting novelty, with the video portraying a thrilling encounter with the Kraken itself, it just had too many problems to be feasible. Whether you realize it or not, an important part of an intense coaster experience is being able to see the track ahead of you and bracing for the elements. The VR headset obviously obstructs your vision, which led to people getting thrown around and getting sick, but the need to also clean and secure each headset led to extremely lengthy loading times in the station, which resulted in long and unwarranted wait times. Kraken Unleashed removed the VR headsets late in 2018, but that year also had the spring premiere of an Intamin river raft attraction, Infinity Falls. Located in the area that was the former Clydesdale hamlet, the terrace still does exist, but it is now accessible by walking over a bridge that spans the Rapids ride. Thematically, Infinity Falls is very different from the rest of SeaWorld, as its theme is focused on water conservation, and throughout the queue and station, it tries to sell you the idea that you're an explorer traversing wetlands. The actual ride experience is a great family addition, but its rapids are also very intense, which makes it pretty fun. Elements that stand out are the flamingo exhibit near the start of the ride, as well as the elevator that takes you wrapped up 40 feet and drops you down a slide, which are fun novelties that allow this attraction to really stand out, even among most other parks. Despite the recent slate of additions though, SeaWorld attendance continued dropping, and in March of 2017, Blackstone sold off its controlling stake to a Chinese firm, Zhonghong Group, which ousted Manby in February of 2018, resulting in a revolving door of CEOs over the next few years. His last planned project for the park premiered in 2019 though, which rethemed the rides of Shamu's Happy Harbor and incorporated them into the new land of Sesame Street. Among all the issues that SeaWorld was experiencing, this land turned out remarkably well, and at first had a ton of entertainment and meet and greets found throughout. It was an excellent, high-quality replacement for an aging kids area, and it's unfortunate that Manby wasn't around to see it open, especially since park attendants started picking right back up after he was fired. However, Zhonghong Group defaulted on its loans in 2019, and another private equity firm, Hillpath Capital, swooped in, buying a controlling stake of 34.5%, which brings us to the mess that the company is in today. In May of 2019, land clearing began in the Sea of Power right next to Wild Arctic, and the only coaster ever planned by Zhonghong Group would be erected. When Hillpath Capital took over, they continued its construction, and this striking orange track, which was very different for SeaWorld, was fully finished by February of 2020. However, with the pandemic and the shutdown of the park the following month, SeaWorld was once again in extreme financial trouble, and just as its attendance was beginning to recover from Blackfish 2. By this point, the dolphin, sea lion, and orca shows mostly dropped the theatrics, and were reworked into educational showcases on animal care, but through 2021, the new orange coaster just sat, standing but not operating. Finally, in February of 2022, the new coaster opened as Icebreaker, which was manufactured by Premier, and was an addition that I wasn't sure made sense for the park. It was originally stated in 2019 that the coaster would be the first step in a revitalization of this area, and while the quick service restaurant Mango Joe's was rebranded as Altitude Burgers, and the Wild Arctic building introduced the Glacier Bar, the actual Wild Arctic simulator never reopened after the park did in 2020. The animal exhibit was still there, but only accessible through its gift shop, so most people weren't aware that it even existed or stayed open. So, with Icebreaker debuting, was it even a good addition for the park? What made Busch Gardens and SeaWorld stand out in the Anheuser-Busch era was that their coasters were carefully selected and designed to all be major attractions, and were often highly themed. Even Mako was a great continuation of the Busch era, but post-2009, the coaster additions in the parks became a lot more mediocre. In 2015, Busch Gardens Williamsburg opened a premier coaster model known as the Skyrocket 2, named Tempesto, which was then cloned to SeaWorld San Diego in 2018 as Electric Eel, and then to Busch Gardens Tampa as Tigress in 2019. I find the layouts incredibly underwhelming with poor capacity, and the premier trains are absurdly small and cramped. While it was nice that Icebreaker wasn't another Skyrocket 2, I was turned off by its small, uncomfortably cramped trains in a coaster layout that looked unremarkable, as it was likely designed and constructed for cheap, which contrasted with the legendary B&Ms across the rest of the park. Still, once it opened, I was surprised at how intense this little coaster is through its aggressive ejector airtime, and it's a surprisingly wild ride that I'm glad to have been wrong about. Even its garish paint color has grown on me, but while it did include some theming with ice and rocks around the entrance, it was still a massive step down thematically from the Busch years. It soon became clear that Hillpath Capital would be the worst owner of SeaWorld though, as prices in the park went through the roof, food quality went down even further, and ride operations became some of the slowest I've ever seen in the park. On top of this, the new SeaWorld was pushing a garbage, non-functioning app, which was required if you wanted any basic park information, which itself is a ploy to sign you up for email advertisements. And in 2022, the park started adding hidden 5% surcharges when buying food and merchandise. From what I've heard, employee benefits and pay were cut even further, and the park retained the smallest number of staff possible to operate, which often does not even seem like enough, as rides sometimes unexpectedly close a few hours early without notice. While really only an aesthetic complaint, I also want to add how Kraken was repainted in 2022, which adopted a new ugly seafoam track with dark blue supports, while keeping the trains the old teal color, not even putting up the money to have them repainted to match. It's clear that Hillpath Capital is only interested in exploiting consumers by nickel and diming, while cutting other costs and staff to the bone, and one of the best examples of this was the failure of Antarctica Empire of the Penguin to reopen. It's pretty well known across the industry that SeaWorld management just let the ride vehicle sit during the 2020 shutdown, which caused irreparable damage to the batteries in the vehicles. Operationally, SeaWorld has now become the Six Flags of Orlando by operating as cheaply as possible, and this was seen with their new 2023 edition. Opening in May, Pipeline the Surf Coaster was built in former event space and was purchased for cheap from B&M as it is an experimental model. Obviously themed to surfing, this is a new interpretation of the B&M stand-up model, but with bouncing restraints designed to accommodate rider comfortability. However, with an underwhelming layout and unexpected airtime that results in you slamming your crotch down on the pommel of the restraint, I personally don't think that this is a positive addition. Like Icebreaker, the theming and landscaping is also minimal, and the park didn't even bother to rework a clear pathway to get here, resulting in you either walking through Flamecraft Bar or trying to squeeze through a bottleneck down at the waterfront. In 2024, SeaWorld opened yet another experimental B&M coaster, this time a family model known as Penguin Trek. Since Empire of the Penguin would have been prohibitively expensive to reopen, this new family coaster was installed in the building, and while it's not much, admittedly it does have some passable theming through the queue. Once boarded and exiting the station, the coaster track takes you through icy caves, where you see some light theming elements and penguins on a screen, but as you reach the exit, you're launched out into the Antarctica area, where the rest of the coaster runs through a spaghetti bowl behind Expedition Cafe. While constructed for cheap, as this was B&M's showcase of their new family coaster, and so the ride has a new train type and no inversions, I will say that it's a pretty decent ride, and a good pivot towards families with younger children. The theming is a bit more than I expected, although I know that it wouldn't exist if the building wasn't just being recycled, but what drags this coaster down is again bad operations with a slow-moving line, and the fact that the coaster forces you to wait in another line while exiting to go see the penguin exhibit. Seeing the penguins is a cool idea that's badly executed, as you're not allowed to exit the building any other way, so if you just want to get off the ride, it takes you an extra 10 minutes just to leave, which is incredibly frustrating but not surprising, considering the abysmal state of park management. This brings us to the end of the history of SeaWorld Orlando, the flagship park, and hopefully you found its journey through the years interesting. From tracing the origin of SeaWorld and the original San Diego park, to its expansion into Orlando and what that early park looked like and contained, I do find the early years fascinating. Its emphasis on animal shows, and especially the orcas, allowed it to stand out from other amusement parks of the era, and under Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, many staples of the experience like Shamu Stadium and exhibits for sharks and penguins helped establish the SeaWorld brand. It was Anheuser-Busch that then sent the park into a new era though, emphasizing theming with extensive exhibits and rides, along with massive distinguishing coasters that allowed SeaWorld to stand out among its Orlando competition. Even during the troubled 2010s, being passed around by private equity firms and reeling from the 2010 Tillicum incident and 2013's Blackfish, the park managed to evolve with solid additions like Mako, Infinity Falls, and Sesame Street, before falling prey to Hillpath Capital, which is milking profit out of the park and aimlessly adding mediocre coasters as a quick and cheap way to draw people in. The bones of SeaWorld today are solid for what could potentially be a great park, but for that to happen, its owner has to truly care. I can imagine a SeaWorld with a few quality dark rides, a revived waterfront area with actual quality shopping and dining, and an emphasis on animal exhibits while still moving away from the orcas. During the short Manby period, there was even an idea for a reworking of the entrance area and the addition of a resort. At that time, the idea was a bad financial investment, but in a different scenario where the park remained under Anheuser-Busch, I can see something like that being welcome. The potential for SeaWorld to be a competitive family park in Orlando is there, but with the emphasis on cheap coasters and Six Flags operations, The park just isn't on the radar of most tourists, as it's being run into the ground. A lot of coaster enthusiasts always like to comment and say how great the park is on various videos I put out, but if you're not going on a weekday during the off-season, the park is a dirty mess with obnoxious crowds, incredibly slow operations, and there's nothing worth really buying or eating, as the prices even eclipse competitors while still offering lower quality. SeaWorld could be a great place, and I don't think it would even be that difficult to get it back on track, but hopefully, through exploring its history, it's given you a pretty clear picture of its rise and relatively quick fall. It's interesting knowing how different the original park looked like from what is there today, and if you really search for it, you can see how many old structures were hidden under theming from the Anheuser-Busch era. There are certainly smaller details that I've missed, and sometimes I was only able to provide a range of dates rather than something more precise, but I wanted to illustrate the broad history of the park to the best of my ability, as no one has ever bothered to go so in depth like this. If you enjoyed the video, please do me a favor of leaving a like, especially since this has taken an immense amount of time to research. And if you ever come across someone looking for the history of this park, please point them towards this video. As always, if you have not yet subscribed and hit the bell notification yet either, you can do so now to be alerted to new videos as they release.